Well, welcome everybody. Appreciate you guys coming out today. 5 o'clock, man, that's a real tough time to present. Some of you guys are probably sitting at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Some of you have already left and went home. But you are in Path to Production Value Stream Mapping in a DevOps world. I am Jamie O'Mara, and this is my partner, Ben. Just a little bit about me before we get started. I've been a platform engineer here at Pivotal for about the last 5 years. Prior to that, I was at VMware for 3 years, and then I've had different roles as a software practitioner over the last 18 years, and just have a little bit of fun. I've also been a Hawaiian cliff diver, and this is actually me climbing up, getting ready to jump in. And this is my partner.
My name is Ben Kamsey. I am a director of platform architecture out of the SoCal region. I've been doing software for about 17 years in various different roles, and this is what happens when I let Jamie do bio slides. We won't be doing that going forward.
Yeah, we just try to keep it a little bit lighter, because sometimes these talks can get boring. But what's not boring are industry trends. I love industry trends. Industry trends tell you a lot about what's happening, what customers are trying to do, what enterprises are trying to do, what ISVs are trying to do, right? Like, what is it that's going on in the industry, and what are people being successful with, and what are they failing with? Now, what I want to do is share 4 trends with you that I think are pretty important that you probably have seen in the last 3 years. I know that you've seen plenty of this at the conference here, but I want to go ahead and start with the first one, and that's digital transformation. Now, usually this trend shows up on some C-level executive to say, this is what we must do, but we have no idea how we're going to do it. But what I think is interesting about things like digital transformation is it's a use of technology to actually help create a new preferred user experience, right? So you see this everywhere. It's happening everywhere in front of us. You look at things like Uber, Airbnb, right? Different type of experience. The mobile phone provides that for you. Things like Lime and the Freebird stuff. You see all this happening around us. That's the digital transformation actually coming to market for us. The next trend that you see a lot of, and I've seen this since about 2014, was DevOps, right? It sounds really good. It sounds really sexy. We've kind of all have our own ideas of what we think DevOps is, but I think the real company that did this for the first time was Netflix. I saw this in about 2014, and it was really that culture and that practice of using automation and monitoring to help deliver software. They did an excellent job of it. They did it at scale, and they did it on top of AWS APIs. The next was agile culture. So as a software practitioner for 18 years, I used to think that I did agile all the time. And I thought, oh, this is great. We followed some of the practices, but it wasn't until I actually stepped in and started working at Pivotal Labs that I started to really understand what agile meant. The practices that were built up didn't just happen overnight. It became a very learning organization, and it took a long time for them to get to that point. Like it was growing for the last 25 years. But to actually see it and then watch it work at scale and watch these different pieces move is super important in my opinion. And then the last is around lean principles. So this is actually something that you probably heard a lot more about recently, but this has been around since the mid-'80s, right? Toyota made this famous. They looked at it and said, what are the ways that we can deliver more value to our customers in a shorter amount of time, and how do we do that? We do that by reducing our waste. We provide respect for our people, and most importantly, we do continuous improvement. And that's where the lean principles kind of come into practice. So if there's one thing that I would ask for you, all of you, to take away with you when you leave this presentation today, that is that release velocity is going to be the most important thing that you can do for your organization. And if you're not at the organizational level, do it for your team, right? So everything I'm about to show you here are real examples of customers that followed these types of principles and what they were able to achieve out of doing such. Now, I do want to point out that all of these presentations, all of these customer examples, they all came out of Spring 1, 2017. So it started here with Garmin. Garmin actually started their journey onto a platform and using these types of practices in 2014. I was actually fortunate enough to work with them for the first year when they started with the platform. They didn't really achieve their release velocity, which was 1,100 times to production a month, until somewhere in 2017, right? But if you think about that, that was 50 times a day. How many of us in this audience today can say that you release software across your application inventory 50 times a day? I bet it would be very challenging. One guy, yeah, okay, that's good. I'm glad to hear that. Do you work for Garmin? Oh, Boeing, okay, all right. So I don't have you on here, but you do have your own journey. Another one is Scotiabank. Scotiabank stood up last year and did a keynote, 3,000 deployments to production a month. across 29 different teams in 4 countries, right? So it's a highly regulated industry, right? A lot of us think, oh, well, we're highly regulated. We can't do that kind of stuff, but you can. It does happen. Home Depot, early in the process, right? So they do about 1,500 deployments a month to production and 17,000 just for last year. Allstate was another one I was actually able to get involved with early. I didn't spend a ton of time with them, but by 2017, they did 11,500 deployments to production. Now think about that. That's across 96 different products if you look at the bottom. I will tell you that all the enterprises I work with, 96 products is nothing. If I know what most of your application inventories are. I mean, you're talking thousands of applications. They're doing this across 96 products. So their application release velocity is super high. Now this one I think is very interesting because T-Mobile went from 72 steps and 7 months to deliver to production down to just 7 days, right? And so looking and going through a value stream mapping of trying to figure out how to do that, how to change my culture and my process and apply tools to that to get down to these types of delivery times takes a good amount of effort, but the reward is well worth it. And then the last one for me is Liberty Mutual, and I think this one's pretty interesting too. They do 1,000 deployments to production a month, and they do 2,500 deployments a day across dev, test, UAT. And what's happening there is they're exercising that process day in and day out for every release. So they're just reaffirming everything that they've spent their time doing, and then they're tracking it, and they're delivering those kind of metrics into management who can really look at and understand what is it that we're doing. One last thing I would mention about this, for them, that's only 600 applications. Now, I don't know specifically for Liberty Mutual, but I'd be willing to bet that their application inventory, 4,000 or 5,000 applications. This is only for 600 of them. So you might be asking yourself, how do they do this magic? And that's what Ben is going to take you through. We're going to talk about what a value stream mapping is.
So a value stream is a sequence of activities that it takes to get into production. And Jamie mentioned the fact of like release velocity. I like to look at it as time to value. How long does it take to get from an idea into production? Because the only value that we're going to see out of any software that we're producing is when workloads are actually in production and users are able to hit it at that point. So by mapping out the value stream right here, we can kind of figure out what those activities are to get us into production. And then the process that we do against that value stream is this value stream mapping and figuring out what are the macro steps that are inside of that process in order to get us out into production so that we can increase efficiency and reduce waste during that. So if we kind of look at it as a high level, you can see that we have information flow up on the top level up there, which is kind of how is information flowing from one team to the other. The workflow, as we move these things through each one of these steps, how is the actual workloads going in between there? And that could be either software deliverables, whether it be parts of test, whether it be documentation, anything like that would go inside of that workflow. And then down at the bottom, we're actually measuring the timeline right there, both the process time, how many hours does it take to actually complete these tasks, as well as the lead time, how long does it take from start to finish? So if I say I can get a VM spun up in an hour, but it takes me 2 weeks to get through that requisition process, we want to capture both pieces of those metrics while we're going through this exercise. So if we look at each one of the terms that are involved in this thing, you can see that each one of the steps are on there. We have the actors. What is the team that's going to be involved in that, whether it be operations, whether it be dev, security, any one of those is definitely going to be important to figure out where these handoffs are actually happening. The lead time, which I touched on already, and the process time as well. And then quality down there is the % CA portion of this thing. So we could be moving incredibly fast, but if we're not being accurate in our work and we have to keep redoing steps over and over again, it's probably not going to be helpful for us in terms of the actual overall output that we're doing towards the end goal of this. And then the throughput on the bottom is one that we don't touch on quite as much when we do a lot of these in customers, but that is how many concurrent tasks can we do in this. So if you find that there is something that we can only do one thing concurrently, like say security needs to go through and audit everything at that point. If that's going to be the bottleneck at that point, we want to identify that in the process and figure out how we can optimize that specific step to make sure that we can go ahead and get that time to value as close to the lead time as we possibly can. So if we look at it from a depth chart right here, you can see that we're talking about the macro perspective here of what are the high-level processes as we move through this. If we're getting down into individual steps, we're probably going too low in the stack on this thing to figure out where the actual handoffs are going here. So if we would say that like we're doing a artifact that we're deploying at this point, that's probably the level we want to go at, not these are the individual pieces of code that are going into it, and like worrying about like, hey, what on a day-to-day basis is a developer doing as we're producing that artifact at that point. So if we look at it from the actual timeline from start to finish, you can see that we have value-added tasks in green on this bar right here, and non-value-added tasks in the red. And the idea is we're going to try to eliminate as many of those non-value-added tasks as possible, and then go ahead and shorten that actual lead time into what the process time is. So the closer that we can get that lead time to the process time is going to help us be as efficient as possible. Now, I do want to go into the definitions of what we mean by value-added tasks and non-value-added tasks, because it's extremely important to understand what we mean by those terms. So value-added would be things that we absolutely need to do inside of that, like producing software, producing documentation, things like that are definitely important, and we want to make sure that those are the processes that we're focusing in on. Non-value-added but necessary, things like doing actual production support documentation and things like that. Like when we actually push the thing out there, what kind of stuff do we need to worry about as it starts rolling out into production? So we still need to do these tasks, but they're maybe not necessarily going into the end product that we're actually producing at this point. And then non-value added but not necessary is if we have a bunch of things like sign-offs and things like that that we could automate, those are the kind of tasks that we want to go ahead and eliminate from the value streams or automate out of the process that we're doing. So if we look at like how this life cycle actually works, we usually spend about 4 weeks prepping up to the meeting, and that's both figuring out who we're going to be involving from the organization, as well as what kind of tasks we're going to try to be sussing out from each of those groups. And then it's about 3 days that we end up sitting down, working with each of the individual groups to figure out what is this current state that we're dealing with right now, what's our desired future state, and then how do we actually get to that future state through a transition plan at this point. And then you can see that we are repeating the cycle over and over again. So all of those customers that Jamie mentioned right there, it wasn't, hey, we're going to start with a really long path to production and then magically get it down into something short the first iteration around. We're going to iterate over that process and start eliminating steps along the way, but iterating over it so that we can try to get to that end state down the road as opposed to doing it just as one fail swoop. So some of the things that we've learned along the way of doing these in many different customers is we need to create a safe environment where everybody can kind of tell their truth. So the operations team may have one view of a situation, the development team may have another view, and we want to get both perspectives of that. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle of what each of the groups is thinking it takes in terms of the actual lead time to get something done. We want to establish the rules up front so that everybody's on the same page of what we're going to be talking about and how we're going to be going through the process. And then while we're doing it, we want to make sure that we have a good facilitator that can actually talk through, ask the important questions, and really get out what are the steps that are going on inside of this. And then after we get done with that entire process, how do we actually tell that story to the executive sponsors that care about what we're actually doing in terms of this path to production? And then as we move towards the future state, we want to go ahead and start reducing some of the silos. So any one of those handoffs that we were talking about right there, the more that we can reduce out of those, the better off we're going to be, at least in terms of getting to production. And then during that process, like figuring out what the flow actually is, what key results are we trying to achieve on this thing, and then how are we improving as we move through the states. So if we look at it kind of as a sticky note sort of exercise, and this is typically the way that we do it, we'll put each one of the actual activities on a sticky note, both from the info side of things as well as the actual processes that we're doing underneath it so that we can move things around. And then we'll start associating the actual lead times, process times onto these sticky notes as we're going through the conversation with the customer. So who should we include in this entire process? Now, this is the entire list of everybody that we can include, and it is good to try to get everybody in there, but it's not always necessary to get every single one of these groups. But as you can see, we've got people from all different roles on this one, including the product managers, architects, software QA, the support organization as we get this thing pushed out into production, and then on the right side there, importantly, the operations side of it. What is it going to take to actually get the infrastructure set up? What kind of middleware are we dealing with? Who's the security groups? And then also the networking team is extremely important as we get into production of what kind of firewall rules are slowing us down when we actually move these workloads out there. Now, the idea behind a platform like PCF is if we can start automating a lot of this process, we can eliminate the right side of this portion of being in the value stream and offer it as a service so that as the operators are iterating over that piece of it, they are able to go ahead and produce their value, but it's completely independent of the actual value stream from the software deliverable that we're doing from the start to finish. So if we're going to capture all that data, this is typically the way that we end up doing it. And I mentioned it with sticky notes, but sometimes we end up doing this on the whiteboard where we'll mark out the entire process right here. And this is actually one of the customers that we did. And then you can see that we capture all of that directly into a spreadsheet on the right-hand side there, and then identify like how many new applications are we going to do a year, figure out what the lead time and the process time is, and then we'll actually run ROI calculations on certain pieces of it, go through the kind of the business value, figure out what all this is, and then there'll be a couple other portions of this that we'll do in terms of tying it into what's the labor rate, things like that, so that we can actually generate what the picture of it is for the overall value that we're delivering with this stream. With that, I'll hand it over to Jamie to kind of talk about what outcomes we're shooting for when we end up doing these.
Yeah, so definitely when you start with this process, you want to understand what is the desired outcome. Where am I trying to take this, right? So I think the first thing that you want to understand is, are you delivering your software to production faster as we go through this process? That's what we're really trying to measure. And how do we measure that, right? So like in the case of T-Mobile, you saw them measure the before and the after. So you start thinking about that, and if you have to influence people, you want to be able to show some type of return on investment or just return on time to go through that process. One of the questions I always like to ask customers is, if you made no configuration change to your software and no code change, how long would it take you to deliver? If you tell me it still takes you 3 to 6 months, then that's pure process. It's just sitting in front of that delivery mechanism. And what is the value of some of that, right? You're going to start to find out that if it still takes that same amount of time to deliver, there's a bunch of non-value added stuff in there that's blocking you. It's in your way. And then finally, like Ben had mentioned, is that this is an iterative process. You don't just start today and do it once. It's something you have to continue to do, right? T-Mobile didn't get down to 7 days by just doing it once. We have to continue to do that over and over. But the real key factor is we want to make sure that we start to identify that release velocity. That might be the metric we track internally. But to Ben's point, when you're trying to provide value, it's a good way of selling it. Now, I put this slide in here because I get this every time. We're a highly regulated industry. We can't do that. Well, Scotiabank was a highly regulated industry, right? Some of the customers I'm working with are highly regulated. But the point is if you look at most enterprises, they've been kind of set up as a command and control type of environment, which basically builds no into the process. No, we can't do this. Well, that becomes part of your culture. And when your culture is basically no, because that's what the group told you, it's gonna reflect in the way that you deliver software. The other thing that I've noticed with a lot of customers over the last year is that when you have really strong GRC, which is governance and regulation, is it leads to these creative workarounds, right? So I work with one customer today that has 2 ways of delivering software. There's one way that takes 40 some days or plus, right? And you've got to check the boxes and you got to do all these things before you get there. And then they have a special way of doing it, and it takes 72 hours. But that tells me that there's a very organic need and nature to deliver that software faster. They need to change that process to match, because there's no more time to wait for that. They need to update that process to match it. And I always kind of question that when someone shows that to me. Now, the thing about value stream mapping is it's really there to identify improvement, and you use lean principles to help deliver that release velocity. When you go through this process, definitely keep the end-to-end in mind, right? That whole value chain. Like when you looked at the slides that we talked about where you do development plus delivering it to a platform, that's that end-to-end process. If you only fix half of that, which is you only use a platform to deliver your software, but you don't change the way you build it, guess what? You're not going to get there any faster. You're going to have the same problems, the same challenges. And then look for poor controls, because that will generate interrupt flow. It's pretty common. So I would recommend these 3 books. When I go to conferences, I always look for new things to read. 3 very good books. If you want the lightest of the 3 books to read, you can start with the Value Stream Mapping book. It's where a lot of this content comes from. And if you really want the super, super light version, read the white paper. It's only a couple pages long, just to kind of get yourself started. And then finally, I just share with you this tool that we've been using inside of Pivotal for the last probably about a year or so. It's really a great tool to do a lot of that facilitated work in a remote fashion. So that way, when you're spread out across the country or across the globe, you can easily have people participate if they can't be in the same room. but still have the same feeling of as if they were in the same room. And with that, we will wrap it up. I want you to remember one thing: help establish your team's release velocity. And with that, thank you guys for your time. Oh, and we also open it to questions. So if you have questions, please feel free to just raise your hand and we'll knock them out. Oh, yeah, go ahead, sorry.
So how do you prioritize which waste gets eliminated first?
Oh, yeah. So how do you prioritize which waste gets eliminated first?
Yeah, and typically when we're trying to figure out what we're going to eliminate first, it'll be what's easy to automate or what's more of a checkoff sort of thing. Like I mentioned the fact that like sometimes when we have the regulatory concerns of like a sign off of some executive that needs to go in there, like a lot of times when we end up dealing with that, it's usually with like PCI compliance and things like that, in which case we are certifying the process, not necessarily certifying the actual end result of what we're doing there. So we can typically say that once we've certified the process and we're doing it in an automated fashion, then we don't need to include those steps. So that's typically where we'll try to start out, is anything that we can automate.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much the whole low-hanging fruit, right, up front. But any other questions? Yeah.
So this release to production thing is something probably half the people in the room have dealt with.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if there's a like common value stream map that's been done of that, and where you see like an example of something.
Yeah. So a common one's very difficult because every organization I walk into has different culture, and they're under different pressures and scrutiny. Some have it worse than others, for sure. It just depends on what's going on in the markets and stuff. But I have not seen a real common one. What I have seen common is like the software development lifecycle. I mean, the 20 years that I was doing it, it didn't change that much. But I've seen different ways of getting that done. The way that you build your teams, the way that they work together, who's on a team can change the way that software development lifecycle is done. And that's the one thing I learned being at Pivotal, was watching that in action, where your testers were part of the development team and people paired side by side and use these techniques and processes to make it happen.
Yeah, and I think that's probably the biggest one that I've seen is when the testing group is separate from the actual development group, if they're not in there every single day doing things like TDD, then it's usually that handoff that's taking the majority of the time towards the tail end of when they're looking to do a release of 3 weeks of testing once we get everything completed at that point, and then it's test, fix, test, and some iteration of another, as opposed to just building it into the process and being able to release it as CI/CD at that point.
The one common pattern I do see, and I see this with almost every large enterprise, and I'm not a big fan of, I don't say that I have a great solution to it, is the handoff from here to other parts of the world to go do testing. Because you automatically, artificially generate this feedback loop that now prolongs lead times and process times to get that done. I don't necessarily have a good answer for it today, but I prefer to see that feedback loop shorter. So when I look at that process, that's what I'm looking for. Yeah.
Over all companies that you've worked with, what's been the most effective way or solution or approach to be able to break down the process and actually institute the change that you're recommending?
Yes. So the best processes that I've seen when I'm working with these companies, the first thing is that there's certain processes that you need to follow. So things that I look for that I think really are helpful are retros at the end of everything that you do and your learnings. So that way you can modify and adjust. To me, that's the first step in becoming a learning organization. What we have a tendency to do is build a process and just assume that, we'll sprinkle some metrics in there and then try to figure out how we do that. But if building that process takes 3 months to even vet it, it's too long. Like, we need to make smaller changes, learn and rotate and pivot to those things that work and get rid of the things that don't. Most of the time, that's the problem, is that we don't discover that things aren't working until 6 months into something. That's just too long. Like, we need better feedback loops. So that's what I usually look for. Okay. Anything else? All right. Well, thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Enjoy your conference.